to Dying to Live. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me to have a conversation with you. This is really exciting.
I know it's going to be so fun. I love when my worlds converge, my adventure outdoor world and my podcast world. It's kind of the best case scenario for all of my passions to come together. And I love talking about our adventure experiences. And kind of what we take from them and how we go forward into everyday life after those experiences. And I know that you have a lot to share on that today, so I'm excited to dig in.
Yeah, me too.
So folks know a little bit about you just from having listened to the introduction to this episode, but I think it would be great for folks who maybe, don't spend their lives in the outdoors in the way that you might, to just share a little bit about your background and your impetus for becoming a guide all those years ago. And really, why someone would want to be out there doing those crazy things all the time.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I grew up on the west side of Calgary. So if you've never been to Calgary, Calgary sits just east of the Canadian Rockies. So from where I lived on 43rd Street, I could see the mountains, and oftentimes we'd take dog walks and into the foothills, and we could see the mountains, and I could ride my bike closer to them. And then when I was, I think 7 years old, my older brother gave a gift for Christmas to go cross country skiing in Banff National Park. And it was a, for the time, this was 1972. For the time, it was a pretty creative gift, because this idea of giving an activity of a gift was something really new. And so we rented Nordic equipment and we skied into it was cold. It was minus 20 centigrade, and it was myself and my sister Shauna and him, and he was 17, I was 7, and it was a life-changing experience. We skied into this place called the Ink Pots, which are these deep inkwell-like features in the summer, and in the winter they're just flat spots in a snowfield. But it was profoundly magic. I saw some frozen waterfalls. I connected with the stillness that, even though we were on an adventure activity, I connected with the stillness, and that experience has guided me through all kinds of things in my career. And my career started working at a YMCA camp on the east slope of the Rockies, not far from where I lived in Calgary. And from there, I realized the educative power of being in the mountains, not just the activities, but the stillness. And so as my career developed, I realized that I was interested in venture, but I was also interested in being an educator within the context of adventure. So that brought me to the US in the 1980s to work for Pacific Crest Outward Bound School, where I met Mitsu Uesaki, and being an educator was in kind of the context of being outdoors and rock climbing and mountaineering and being in the desert in Joshua Tree. Those were really, I think that being an outward bound instructor is probably as impactful an experience as it is to be a student on an outward bound course. Just facilitating experiences for other people was a beautiful expression of a career. Even though I didn't make much money, I think I was like hired on in the early years at $45 a day. and then but what's interesting is some of the deeper experiences that I was guiding people through, I was sidestepping, and and what informs my work now is the experience I had in 2003. I was buried working as a mountain guide in the winter. Um, um, and I was going through a process of apprenticeship even then, to be fully certified as an international mountain guide. And I ticked all the boxes for alpine and rock climbing terrain, and I was still working on the backcountry ski terrain.
So maybe can tell people that might not know. So when you get certified as an IFMGA guide,
Mm-hmm.
there are three components, and you have to go through a curriculum and achieve all three, right?
That's right. Yeah, and of course the bar always gets raised. It's probably a lot harder now than it was when I was going through the process. But there's rock terrain, there's ski terrain, and there's alpine terrain if you want to be a fully certified mountain guide. And so I jumped through the hoops of being a rock guide, or at that point you needed to do the assistant rock guide exam, and then the alpine rock portion of the exam covered you off in all rock terrain.
Mm.
Um, and then the alpine portion, which covered glacial travel, covered alpine snow faces, snow climbing and ice climbing, and it covered off alpine rock. And so I've been through all of that certification process, and I had one more ticket to achieve, and that was the ski guide exam. So I was an assistant ski guide, and I was gunning for the full ski guide exam, which would give me an international accreditation. Now I decided to do this because I could see that my options were becoming limited without doing it. But my love was being an educator.
Mm.
But during my apprenticeship, I got more of an apprenticeship than I'd bargained for, and it's probably been the most important and difficult and painful apprenticeships of my life, and that was to be in a tragic avalanche accident that involved 13 people, of which 7 people didn't survive.
And how long had you been, consistently in the mountains and working as an assistant guide and all of those good things before this happened?
When this happened, I was 38 years old, and so I'd been very passionately engaged in my outdoor adventure career probably for 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
or even 22 years. And so I was an apprentice, and yet an apprentice with lots of experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so that event, first off, being buried in the snow taught me a lot about myself.
What was that like physically, emotionally, spiritually? What was that like?
Physically, it was cold. Physically, it was restricting. Um, Emotionally, it was a mirror to how I was showing up in the world. I think that I had been using adventure as an escape,
Ooh.
and this was teaching me um, quite profoundly that I was buried in real life.
So this is really interesting because this is the second podcast in a row that I have recorded
Mm-hmm.
with a male
Mm-hmm.
identifying person that has the same theme of using the passion and or professional work, identifying that it was being used as an escape from life, and having then a series of realizations and evolutions in life that led to a different place.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm really fascinated to hear then what happens when you have that realization.
Yeah. Well, the realization um, was one where I discovered that I needed to dig myself out,
Mm. Mm.
and that's a long process, and I'm probably still doing it, right? Like, we're human beings, and we're complex, and we've had all kinds of complex experiences, and we might even show up in this life, if you believe in reincarnation, with all kinds of other things that we might have experienced that we need to address and face, and all of these things, and it's probably a never-ending process. It's a practice. I actually really believe that we don't really learn much. We become aware of practices.
Mm.
For example, if I'm driving my car, some days I'm a bad driver, some days I'm a good driver, and it's just whether I choose to practice being a good driver or not.
Mhm.
um, and so I think that if we perceive we've learned something, then we're less conscious of that thing that we might have learned, and therefore it shows up again. um, and so that's my experience of learning is, oh boy, we keep learning these lessons over and over again if we don't bring them into our everyday consciousness. So being buried in the avalanche was like that. It was an awareness of, wow, I'm kind of not showing up authentically in my life, and I need to do that more. And that's a practice.
What
Absolutely.
did that have to do with, or how did the avalanche unearth that for you?
um, I think that while under the snow, you asked about the emotions that kind of happened. I kind of felt like a little boy. I felt like a little boy that was caught doing something really bad.
Mm.
And upon reflection on that, which took some time, I asked myself, so why would I feel that way? And and it was in part because, or the realization was I hadn't grown up yet.
Mm.
um, I was a fully grown male, but kind of not stepping into um, owning my own beliefs, thoughts, interactions. Just I wasn't owning any of it. I was following, and I was trusting other people too much to cover things for me. And so um, that little that the way that little or that person was showing up needed to die, and maybe they did.
I'm curious too, because in my own experiences of lessons learned over and over and over again until you really take them in and start living your life with those learned experiences, right? There are times when I have had something large happen, not an avalanche, but something large, and I will look back and realize, oh, now I can see all the other ways that these lessons had appeared, that the message was trying to get through, that I had chosen to ignore. So I'm curious if that was part of your reflection as you look back. Could you see all the other ways that you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And when I decided to sit down and write, all of those lessons started to emerge. And so what I discovered was that my life of adventure was trying to teach me a whole bunch of things, but I wasn't paying attention. I was completely unconscious of this incredibly powerful series of lessons that adventure was trying to teach me. And the ironic part is that I called myself an adventure educator.
Mm-hmm.
And this experience was me coming to know adventure education in a way that was far more than I'd ever bargained for. Um, and but um, gave me a, a more authentic place to be an adventure educator from.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You've written a whole book about this and your learnings, and kind of how to take them forward into everyday life. And I want to go there, but before we do, I think people are often interested in a situation like this, like the avalanche. It sounds like you had some really big realizations. You were able to be in touch with who you were in that moment as the little boy. Did did a fear? How did a fear of death, if there was one, come into play? What was your kind of interaction or thoughts or experience around potential death in those moments?
The notion of physically dying never crossed my mind,
Oh wow.
um, and I'm not sure why. But but I think that once the situation became a reality, like once I was dug out, once the newspapers were plastered with, the incredible tragic contents of what happened, and all of the pain of families losing members, and when all of that became a reality, um, there was this incredible fear of living, this incredible, yeah, and and this incredible fear of dying too, like this idea that I realized that I was going to have to die to the person I was on some level,
Mm.
but I was afraid of that. I was afraid of facing the person that made the choices that put me there, me and my clients there, and I was terrified of that. But there was a realization that on some level, like I probably didn't put it into words, but I recognized that um, there was a firing squad of sorts, in that I was standing there and I realized that the firing squad was going to happen, and and it did, but it was really slow.
Well, you couldn't unknow at that point what you had started to know, but I
Mhm.
think that fear of looking at that person, either the person we are right now or the person we know we need to evolve away from or out of. I mean, there's so much fear in that because we're so afraid that we're not going to like what we see, and
Mhm.
there's so much then shame and guilt, and so that's a whole mountain of emotions on its own to
Yeah,
lead.
you're right. There's a mountain of emotions and a mountain of fear, because um, our our behavior to that point is what we know about ourselves. We don't know other behaviors,
Mhm.
and so it's incredibly unsettling. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that that notion. It's incredibly unsettling.
Incredibly unsettling, and so thus then it can take a really long time to you
Hmm.
know kind of pick away at that evolution. But how do you navigate that fear, either then or now or continuously?
Yeah, it starts by becoming aware of it, and so I think in any human life, we're constantly becoming aware of things that don't serve us,
Mm.
and fear is something that doesn't serve us. Um, it serves us in kind of alerting us to danger, but then how we respond to that danger can become more complicated if we let fear run the show. So it's kind of like this: um, fear introduces us to the situation, but then it's up to us to say, thank you for introducing us to this situation, and I've got it from here.
I love that. I love that. What a conversation to have with fear, right? Like, you've done your job. I'm aware. Thank you. And I'm going to go forth, because it's that lizard brain that doesn't know the difference between, being that we're being chased by a tiger, or that we're like stepping up to give a presentation in front of a room full of people, right? It's the
Right.
same trigger, and it's up to us to kind of manage it.
That's right. Yeah, it's a gift and a curse if we let it run wild.
I think that might be the title of this podcast. Thank you, fear. I've got it from here. That's brilliant. I love it. Thanks for that. So,
Thank you.
so you had so many learnings then coming out of this over time. And I know you wrote about them in your book, but I was hoping you would share a little bit about that here. What were those lessons that were trying to be taught that were ignored for so many years that suddenly came into your awareness and you started to integrate into yourself?
Yeah. One of them is self-acceptance. And so sometimes when we are entering into a situation, maybe it's at work, or it's maybe it is, like you said, the presentation that we're about to give. There's this fear that wells up, and it's this idea that we're not enough, and 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 that's a narrative that doesn't necessarily serve us. And to accept accept our fear, and accept that we're going to step into a situation where we're going to be doing our best. And when we can do that, when we can step into acceptance, we protect our value. When we deny ourselves of accepting ourselves, then the narrative is, oh well, I don't have any value, and I don't, well, yeah, accepting ourselves. And that other piece is, one of the things that about acceptance that I learned also helped with accepting the events of my life. And when we can accept events, then we also protect their value too. Just like when we accept ourselves, we accept we protect the value of ourselves. And so the same holds true for events. And so one might say, oh, there's probably nothing good that could come from an avalanche. And what's interesting about truth is that truth is usually bigger than what we perceive. Truth is everything. An event can be both tragic and profoundly beautiful. It can be both. And it can be terrible in that, the things that happened, that, the loss that was occurred, but what comes of it, the awarenesses and the growth that comes of it, is valuable. And it's kind of, the name of your podcast is really beautiful in that, this idea of death and life coming from it. I think that it's a theme that is all around us all the time, and bringing awareness to it is really beautiful. And to ask ourselves, okay, so something needs to die here. I need to accept that something needs to die here, and that has value.
We spend so much time in this culture, this Western culture, being taught to look away from death and to avoid death at all costs. I mean, there's so many industries, right, built up around the whole idea of keeping you as far away from death as possible. Beauty industry being, a major one. Look as young as you can for as long as you can, and don't, for whatever reason, age. And the funeral industry and how traditional funerals are done, and people are made up to look like they're sleeping instead of dying. And I think when we put that much distance between ourselves and the idea or the concept of death, when we lose that familiarity that we had with it eons ago, then it's also a lot harder to navigate those things within us that need to die over time, and those life trends that we have. And then when you add in the fact that we don't have those people in our communities anymore whose role it is to help us navigate those transitions, then suddenly we're out here on our own without idea of how to do any of this. And it's a breeding ground for fear and shame and guilt and all the things that
Hmm.
aren't necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah, and what you're bringing up is this idea that we resist death, and and we resist death of things that don't serve us in our lives, and so
Mm.
they keep repeating. Um, and it's really fascinating because I think we resist death just because we don't know um, what's on the other side.
Hmm.
It could be like the best thing ever. It could be
Hmm.
the best thing ever, and if it is the best thing ever, why aren't we just celebrating when when there's a death? Like, yeah, they're on to the next level. Like, this is so cool.
Right.
Um, but because of our we shy away from mystery. If we don't know something, the ego kind of wants to have a story about everything, and 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 it's so difficult to just be okay with not knowing.
Which is so ironic because we don't know anything. And, life is one giant mystery and the only constant is change. And yet here we are grasping around every turn for as much knowing and as much control as we can possibly have. And it just creates so much suffering.
It does. Yeah, it
What do you,
does.
what do you think about the concept of, so this came up the other day for me with someone as well, the concept of being enough. I love that you're bringing it up because I think that we all think about that in some form or function. This person I was talking to had said, I had said, "Wow, you really look tired. You seem like you're very run down, as we all are in this wonderful pandemic." And they said, "Yeah, I'll take a rest, but I've got some work to do first, and haven't really earned it yet." I was like, you can have a nap just because you're human and you need a rest. You don't have to earn it. We don't have to earn these things. We get to have them just because we're enough in that way. And that concept was mind blowing. It was like they had to sit down and really think about the fact that they were enough just to rest, just to give our body something that we need in general. And so, where do you think that comes from, the not enoughness? Where do we learn that?
Um, I think it comes from media. I think it comes from advertising. If you want to sell a product, then you need to show the your buying public something about how they're inadequate, and that actually starts when, like, right from the get-go. Like, when I was a child sitting in front of the television, like, you don't actually live in a cool family unless you eat Captain Crunch. um,
Well, that's true. Yes.
that may be true.
I mean, it's really good, but
um, and so it's something that we're constantly bombarded with in a capitalist society. Um, and what's interesting is we also think that this path is linear, meaning that if I put work in here right now, if I work my ass off, then the good things will come.
Mm.
Um, but ideas and meeting people and all of those things come when we are also taking good care of ourselves. So as a writer, some of the times that I, kind of solved the pieces that I needed to solve with a particular piece were when I, went out into the mountains. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh yeah, and so then I might take some notes, and then I've actually, or I meet somebody that then, we have a conversation, and then the conversation leads to, um, solving the question that I had or the problem that I had. And so this, this idea that life is linear is also a piece of this thing that, we can only be enough if we're, if we're hammering away in front of the screen. That's not true, and it never was.
Mm. That's powerful. That's powerful. Yeah, think about my own times of getting into that like creative flow ideation, and something that vividly sticks out is one of the last hikes I went on. I ended up being both elated and annoyed with myself because all of these ideas started to flow, and I had my phone, and so now I'm on my phone taking notes so that I don't forget all these ideas. Oh, this is not the purpose of today, but again, it's not linear. And
Right.
when you're out in nature like that and you're breathing the air and you're surrounded by the trees and you're having that experience, it does support your health and well-being in such a way that then allows you to open up and flow, and that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, our observations of nature can also help us connect the dots. So, one of the observations I made about the power of reflection is, for reflection to occur in nature, stillness is required.
Mm.
And the same is true for us, right? Like, for us to actually, kind of look back or learn from events in our lives, I think that stillness is required.
Mm-hmm.
You got to stop, and that can be a really frightening thing. And that was a, also a really important lesson for me, was to stop. And it was terrifying, right? Because I was afraid of what, you know dragons I was running from, what ones were going to catch up and eat me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I've been in that place myself. It is scary until you do the stopping.
Yes.
And
How do you stop?
that's a great question. Sometimes it's a very mindful setting aside of time. So for instance, the early morning hours with coffee and no devices in order to meditate or journal or just sit and enjoy the sun coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, spending time outside when I'm not supposed to be on my device doing so. That is also that is also how.
Mm-hmm.
But I also have this practice that I love and advocate, which is if you have the luxury of giving yourself a good amount of time, and so for me that means like a week off of my office job, a good amount of time to enter into that space without any agenda or any plan, and just allowing yourself to feel into each moment. What do I want to do now? What do I want to eat now? What do I want to not do? How do I want to exist? And allowing yourself to be led in that for a good amount of time is a really wonderful way to connect deeply with your most intimate desires, and to get to know yourself in a way that you're unable to when you're so cluttered and busy all the time.
Yeah. Well, that sounds really great. Not having an agenda.
Right?
Nothing written down in the book. No tick list.
Nothing on the calendar. Amazing. What about you?
A number of things, a number of ways. It's interesting. Just there's behind our house here is Cobble Hill, and it says, it's about 1,000-foot climb to the summit. and just below the summit, there's a park bench, and almost nobody ever sits on the park bench, right? Like there's mountain bikers, there's runners, there's hikers, and people are walking their dog, and and especially when I have something that I need to kind of grapple with, I'll go up there and I'll just sit on the bench. And but also when I was writing, I found cabins and places to go. I actually spent 40 days at Purcell Lodge as a custodian by myself when I was writing the last chapters of Buried.
Ooh.
And that was fantastic. It was absolutely fantastic because Purcell Lodge is this 5-star lodge that has electricity and all the creature comforts, and it's up in the Alpine, or it's that tree line. And so I could go on really great walks, and I could see the transition from summer to fall to winter. When I arrived there, it was kind of late September, and then when I left, it was early November, and there was 40 centimeters of snow on the ground. And so just having the time and space to see that, be with the transition in nature, and be with the transition in myself. Yeah, really, really powerful experience. And stopping is difficult. It's actually really hard to do nothing.
It is 100%.
It's really hard to do nothing. and the word doing nothing is almost taboo.
Oh, in this hustle culture, absolutely it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got to normalize doing nothing.
Yeah.
I see a campaign in our future together.
We need to die to being busy.
Yes, being busy needs to die. Kill it.
Maybe COVID's teaching that to us a little bit.
I think so. And I sincerely hope that we carry that forward in a way that is lasting and meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. With the time that we have, because I want to be conscious of your time as well, maybe we could talk about one more of the lessons that you learned in that time, and then folks can go buy your book to read the other lessons.
Okay. I think that the other lesson that unearthed for me was learning to tell the truth.
Ooh, you are hitting so many big uncomfortable things today.
and again, I would call it a practice. Yeah, there's things about ourselves that we'd like to keep secret, but if we at least share ourselves wholeheartedly with a few people in our lives, I think that that's critical. I suspect that many of us live without anybody really knowing us.
Mm-hmm.
And so truth, it can be painful when there's kind of an ego piece that we need to transcend. And so kind of the truth about working with an editor, if I'm send a piece off to an editor and they come back with all kinds of red marks on it, that can be hard, but it's also a process of, okay, what's true and for me, and how do I sort out the pieces of that. But I think that when we have a practice of being honest and truthful, kind of like the naked truth, when we look at ourselves in the mirror, we start to love the person we are more deeply, because we're showing up authentically.
Mm-hmm.
And Brené Brown talks about being vulnerable, and that's stepping into truth. It's stepping into the things that affect us, the situations that we find painful, um, and when we can and be honest and truthful, um, things just go better. Um, yeah, and from an adventure perspective, when we're honest about our abilities, when we're honest about how we feel about a given situation, when we're honest about conditions, it all becomes safer.
Mm-hmm.
All of it becomes safer. Um, I remember it took me probably 25 years as a rock climber to be able to say to my partner, this part of the climb scares me.
Mm-hmm.
And just that, being able to say that, then we enter into a conversation. Like, they might say, well, why does it scare you? It's like, well, there's this, piece of the climb that's, above a ledge. And if I fall there, I might break my ankles. And then they might say, well, I've got this, equipment that will protect that section. So together we start to solve the problem. Whereas we'd never do that if I didn't open up about it scaring me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same is true for our lives, is that when we are truthful about the things that scare us or the things that we're coming up against, and we share them with people, then the dialogue starts, and we start to access their wisdom and their perspective, which is deeply richer than what we might have been able to come up with on our own. And things just start to solve themselves.
Yeah, we get to see things from a different viewpoint, and that is often helpful. Very rarely in a situation like that is it the opposite. And I love that you brought up Brene Brown. Vulnerability, gosh, it's the connective tissue between all of us. And the more that we can lean into that, the more connected we all are, the more in support and in service to each other we all are. And the richer our life experience becomes, because we're sharing it with others. And to your point, we're not shouldering it on our own. And that terrible, mean voice, ego, comes in and keeps us from doing that.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of work to keep that voice at bay.
Yeah, it does. But there's gold on the other side. There truly is. There's gold on the other side. And what's fascinating about truth is that the older we get, the harder it is to tell.
Yes. Right. Little kids are great at just saying whatever.
Yeah, because they don't, like, what we do is we start kind of loading skeletons into the closet, and like this closet's like over brimming, and then we get like a storage unit for all the skeletons, and then we get a mobile home and stuff some in there too. And so then the process of being 100% transparent becomes like, ooh, then I'm gonna have to tell them about that, and then I'm gonna have to talk about that, and then that, and oh my goodness, no, I'm just not going to do that. Like, I don't want to go into the storage unit.
Right.
The closet's enough. So, for your listeners that are in their 20s, start telling the truth, start connecting, because it only gets worse. It only gets harder. It only gets harder. And, it's interesting, because it is challenging to be honest and show ourselves. Every time somebody says, Ken, I've read your book, there's this little wave of fear that comes up in me, like, oh, I hope I skipped the chapter on XYZ.
Well, you were only human, so.
Yeah. But interestingly, the things that I most fear that I wrote about, I've never been judged on.
Mm-hmm.
Never. And I think that that's true of I think when we show our humanity, we're gifted with acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
We're gifted with the thing that we had always dreamed we'd have.
Mm-hmm. Because people ultimately, as humans, we want to be seen and embraced for what's seen, and we can only do that. Dogs are now on this podcast communicating. We can only do that when we show what's underneath, and it gives other people permission to do the same. So the more that you do that, the more, and then I'll do that, and then this person and that person, and then it'll be, and everybody will be doing it. But it starts with us.
Yeah, it sure does.
Good stuff. Thank you. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. You're doing great work in the world.
Oh, I appreciate that. I'm honored to be able to speak with you, and we could talk for hours. So we should do this again in the future.
Okay.
Tell people, if you would like, tell people where they can find you, and the title of your book and all of that good stuff before we sign off.
Sure. My website is archetypal.ca. And so that's ARCHETYPAL.ca. And the title of my book is called Buried. And it was first published in 2014, and there's a new edition that was had 2 new chapters added with a 5-year out retrospective chapter just last September in 2020. So yeah, and it's available on Amazon or my website.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.